see you. Thanks for coming. How are you, sir? Nice to see you. Thank you. Thank you, Kelsey. Really appreciate it. Nice to see you again.
Good to see you.
Please give Kelsey a round of applause. Thank you so much, Kelsey, for your leadership on so many levels and for being here. And thanks to all of you for coming out today. It's great to see you. Last time we were here in Muscatine, Kelsey actually walked us around and was talking through some of the environmental threats that are of concern here, both to the air and to the water. And so it's good to be back to be able to hear more from you about what's going on and what's top of mind for you. It feels like it wasn't that long ago because there's a lot that's happened between then and now. Let's see, I want to start with something that we often talk about, whether we're here in Iowa or New Hampshire and other states, because to me it really gets to the heart of the challenges that we're facing. You know, Kelsey was talking about healthcare. This is something that is top of mind everywhere we go because more and more people, as he said, are in this predicament and living with this fear that they're not ultimately able to get the care they need when they need it most. That when they or their child or their loved one is in a situation where they get sick or there's an accident or an emergency, it's a question of, well, how am I going to make sure they get taken care of, or am I going to be able to pay the rent or the mortgage or put food on the table? As healthcare is such a top of mind issue, there is a central point in Washington that has to be addressed of why are we in this situation? Why is it that election after election after election, we are continuing to debate the same old issues? That even with the passage of the Affordable Care Act, while there have been some improvements, there are still tens of millions of people in the country who are not able to get the care that they need. It comes down to this foremost issue, the fact that our government is not one that's of, by, and for the people. It's not fulfilled this vision that our founders have laid out for us. It is a government that is controlled and influenced by the very few, the very rich, and the very powerful. That's how we end up with the challenges that we're facing. That's how we end up with a healthcare system that is driving up the profits of big insurance and big pharmaceutical companies to the detriment of people, exploiting the sick, exploiting those who are at their greatest time of need to drive up their profits and line their pockets. And we see how evident this is in the policies that are being written, how they take shape before they're finally passed, is you have a lot of big, high-powered lobbyists who will go in there and go through it and say, nope, take this part out, this one is bad for us, this one's bad for our industry, and then you end up with something that maybe began with good intention, but it gets so watered down with all of these provisions in there that end up undermining that original intent of that legislation. This is what we are seeking to fix. You know, the change, the problems, the challenges that we have right now, they did not all just begin in November of 2016, the day after the election, or after Trump was inaugurated in January of 2017. There are a whole host of issues that have arisen since he took office, but when we're looking at so many of the things that are top of mind, these are systemic challenges that have gone on for a very long time. And in order to solve them, we've got to get to this root cause of the problem, this corruption, really, and it is corruption that exists within our own government, that crosses party lines, that speaks to those very rich and few and powerful who have benefited from a system that serves their interests for far too long, rather than serving ours. This gets to the heart of one of the main reasons why I'm running for president. Because you, every single one of you, every single person in this country deserves to have a government, to trust that your government is listening to your voice and is focused one-pointedly on serving your interest, on putting the well-being of the people first and foremost, ahead of political interests, ahead of profits, ahead of any selfish interests. And it's bringing these values that are at the heart of every soldier and service member, these values of service above self that I seek to bring to the White House, to restore integrity and honor and respect back to the White House so that this focus in our government is focused on serving you. And by doing that, then we can begin to see the solutions. We begin to have the dialogue as Americans across party lines, Democrats, Republicans, independents, libertarians coming together saying, hey, I love my country. I love the American people. We care for each other. We care for our neighbors, friends, coworkers. We want to make sure that we are building a brighter future together. And let's bring the diversity of the ideas that we have standing on this foundation as fellow Americans to move us together forward. And by doing so, then we can address the systemic problems that we're dealing with in things like healthcare, and making sure that no matter who you are, where you come from, how little money you have in your pocket, you're able to get the quality care that you need, period. Now, there have been some questions raised about my position, how it contrasts with other presidential candidates on healthcare. I think this Medicare for All plan is the foundational core concept of how we achieve this, how we make sure that there is healthcare for all. I think it's also for those who are members of unions or those who have employer-sponsored plans that they want to keep, they have the freedom to do that. But they have the freedom to keep the plan that they have. But that does not take away or undermine the ability to make sure that everyone is able to get the care they need when they need it. When you look at every other developed country in the world that has some form of universal health care plan, whether it be a single payer or all the different models that are out there, every one of them recognizes that there is a balance that's there. And there's a freedom of choice that's there for people. If you want to stick with your employer-sponsored plan, that's fine, but that will not stop us in our mission and our objective of making sure that every American is able to get that quality care. I was asked by a reporter recently, well, gosh, Tulsi, that seems like such a compromise. Compromise to who and for what? My thought process is very mission-focused. And when we recognize the opportunity that we have as a country to bring down the cost of care that we are already paying right now by eliminating the profits that big insurance makes off of our current model and delivering a health care for all system, this is not a compromise for us to be able to meet that mission. When we look at some of the other challenges that we're dealing with, things like immigration reform, this is something that continues to be an issue that's constantly raised. If you're in Washington, all you hear about is how terribly divisive this issue is. But as I travel across your state, I hear from folks, Republicans and Democrats, who raise different concerns about how broken our immigration system is. How it's not serving our economy, how it's hurting families, tearing families apart, how it's undermining the legal immigration system that we have. When we actually have this dialogue, we see, hey, we actually have more in common than what cable news media will have us realize. And when we sit in rooms like this and we have a constructive dialogue, then we can make progress together. Criminal justice reform is a great example that I point to because we've recently had a strong victory in Congress, when there aren't very many, around prison reform. It's a legislation called the First Step Act, had bipartisan support, had leaders in the Democratic representation and the Republican Party's representation supporting this legislation. You had people like Jared Kushner working directly with a very progressive activist, Van Jones. You had the ACLU working with the Koch Foundation. People coming together from both sides of the political spectrum saying, hey, we've got to bring about this change. And this legislation was signed into law a few months ago. I was speaking with Van Jones, who's a friend of mine, a couple of nights ago, and he said what people don't realize is that this legislation alone has, I want to get the number correct here, it has made it so that those who are in prison, thousands, over 4,000 people, are no longer there, and they are back with their families, and they are involved with programs that are reducing the recidivism rates in our country. The impact of this is really tremendous. It is only the first step. There's a lot more that we can do, but this shows what's possible when people are willing to set their own partisan politics aside. Stop thinking about, well, I can only focus on how we win the next election, and instead say, hey, we've got to get stuff done. Every one of you cast your votes for your elected leader, your elected representative, whether it be at the local, state, or national level, and you do so with the hope and the trust that they will work for you, not go and work for a political party, not go and work for some other special interests or big moneyed lobbyists, but they'll actually work for you. And the passage of legislation like this, the First Step Act, is an example of what's possible when we do that. Now, this is just one example, and we have so much more to do. The other one I'll bring up before we open up to questions is climate change, protection of our environment. Once again, if you're in Washington and you hear climate change and there's climate marches happening in Washington and around the world, there are more and more people who are concerned about climate change. But it's still a divisive issue here, where these words are such a hot button thing. If you have climate change legislation that comes forward, odds are you'll have Democrats vote for it and Republicans vote against it. But it's not a partisan issue. Because what we're talking about is not politics. We're talking about our health, our well-being, the well-being of our loved ones, our community, our ability to live in a safe place in the community that we love. That's really what it comes down to, in saying, what are the things that are contributing to polluted and toxic water? What are the things that are contributing to toxins and pollution in our air? What are the things that are threatening our communities, our safety, and our security? And then begin to seek to solve those problems. Because the things that are contributing to these threats, these environmental threats, are broad and they are varied. And unless we get to the root cause of those problems, we will not be able to stem the increasing threats that we're facing. When we bring people together around these shared human interests, then we can begin to make progress. We can begin to say, all right, we are spending almost $30 billion every year to subsidize big fossil fuel corporations. That's what we're spending right now, we as taxpayers. Instead of doing that, let's end those subsidies and look at, hey, how can we invest more into clean renewable energy? It is not only better for our environment, it's also become a lot cheaper. So when we look at our pocketbook and we're thinking about how much we're paying in our electricity bills and what we're paying every month for our power bill, it's becoming cheaper and cheaper to rely on clean renewable energy than it is on traditional fossil fuels. We look at some of the changes that we need to make, not only in that transition from fossil fuels, but also in our agriculture. We look at our soil quality, for example. I know this is a big issue here across Iowa, and how for so long the farm bill that's passed out of Congress every year has subsidize and incentivize these big multinational agriculture corporations who very often will come in, use non-sustainable farming practices, monocrops that actually end up ruining the soil, and then they'll pick up when they can't farm there anymore and go somewhere else and stay there for a while until they can't farm there anymore, and just use and abuse and move on, thinking only about their profits, not really about the people who live in these communities, those who are dependent on agriculture in these communities. And so that's the kind of change we can bring about, where instead of looking at those special interests, we can look at the farm bill and say, how do we incentivize and support and empower farmers to be able to make a living, to support their families, to continue to farm, ensuring that soil quality remains, support regenerative farming practices, support our family farms, support those who are growing food that's actually feeding our communities. These are the kinds of things that we can, changes that we can bring about when we are coming together and thinking, okay, what's actually in the best interest of the people? Is this legislation, is this bill going to actually help people, or is it going to hurt them to serve the interests of the very rich, the very few, and the very powerful? This is at the heart of the change that I seek to bring about. All of these things require investment. All of these things require focus and resources. And there's one issue that's central to our ability to dedicate those resources towards serving the interests of the people. And that issue is the cost of war. when we realize that since 9/11 alone, we as taxpayers have wasted over $6 trillion on these wasteful regime change wars that have taken a tremendous toll on our troops, on my brothers and sisters in uniform, those who paid the ultimate price, who never came home, those who came home with both visible and invisible wounds. When we see the pain and the destruction and suffering caused by people in these other countries where we wage these wars, and we realize that every single dollar that's gone to pay for these wars that have weakened our national security, strengthening terrorist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, is a dollar that has come out of our schools. It's a dollar that's come out of our healthcare system, out of our local infrastructure needs, out of all of the things that we need to address right here at home. It's important to understand this because too often people say, oh, you know, foreign policy is just this one issue way over here. We have all of these other things that we really, really need to focus on. We really need to be concerned about. When you look at some of the presidential debates that have already happened, and you look at the 2-hour-long debate, you're lucky if you get maybe 1 or 2 questions about foreign policy or what kinds of decisions you would make as a commander-in-chief, or how would you lead, and you know, where would you decide to send our troops into harm's way versus not, and asking the kinds of questions that you would expect as a voter so that you can make a decision about whether or not this person is actually qualified and capable to fulfill that most important responsibility as commander-in-chief. But instead, you get maybe 1 or 2 questions. I think in the last debate, there were 0 questions about veterans, how best to serve and honor the service and sacrifice of our veterans. And instead, for the rest of the hour and 50 minutes, you get a lot of back and forth and tit for tat and everything else. The cost of war is central to every other issue that we face, because unless we stop wasting countless lives and trillions of our taxpayer dollars, we will not have the resources we need to meet the needs of our people right here at home. I'm running for president, bringing the experience that I have, both serving as a soldier for over 16 years, deploying twice to the Middle East, serving in Congress for nearly 7 years on the Foreign Affairs Committee, the Armed Services Committee, the Homeland Security Committee, bringing this experience and this understanding of how important our national security is, to be able to walk into the Oval Office on day 1 prepared to fulfill that responsibility of commander-in-chief, to end these wasteful wars, to work to end this new Cold War and arms race and redirect those resources we would have continued wasting towards serving the interests of our people and nation building right here in our communities at home, putting the well-being and the interests of our people in our country above all else. This is why I'm running for president. This is why I'm asking each of you for your support in joining me in this movement to bring about this change in focus and the change in leadership and come together as a country for each other and for our future. Thank you so much. I'd love to hear what's on your mind, your thoughts, concerns, questions. Sure.
I have come prepared.
All right. Oh, wow, you really are prepared.
Yeah. It's, there you go.
Okay.
And I'll let you kind of browse through that. And my name is John Timmons, and my wife, Carol. I get over here.
Hi. I know, I'm just teasing you.
Okay. My wife, Carol, and my wife was a practitioner, and she had a medical clinic up in northern Missouri, and I managed the clinic. So I know the healthcare system really well. Now, my thoughts on how to lower the cost of prescription drugs are here. Mm-hmm. Now, my thought was to say you go into a doctor, and the doctor looks you over and decides to give you a prescription, okay? Then you would go to a web page, and you would have the drugs that are available for that malady, the cost of that, then reviews from the doctors and reviews from the patients. Right now, the doctors don't even know what these drugs are costing. They send you down to the store, and you get calls back and say, I can't afford that, give me something else. And you go through that, okay? A simple web page that any high school student could put together would give you competitive marketing as far as drugs go. And the other thing is, what is the other fact? We're talking 20% to 50% from the pharmacy. The drugs should come directly from the manufacturer. And here's the reason why. 1 in every 25 scripts has an error. You didn't realize that. Look, go down to your drugstore. Look in the back, see all those pills. Somebody's got a question for me.
Do you have a question? That's my question.
Well, we go. Yeah.
Wait, because there will be other people that will also want to
Oh, yeah, okay. All right, man, let me finish up here. Yeah, let me finish up here. So, basically, it's how to put together a program to reduce the cost of prescription drugs, and it's very simple. Very simple. It would give you a competitive edge somewhere along the line. And thank you Tulsi, very much.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing this with me, and thank you for sharing this. Absolutely, we'll read this over. Thank you. This is. I think there's a few different approaches that we need to take to this, and competitiveness in pricing and transparency for the consumer, I think, are two integral parts of accountability and bringing down the cost of big pharmaceutical drugs. There is none currently. Exactly. There is none. There's a few things I would add to that. Number one is, and this is something I think we've talked about before many times, which is changing the law to make it so Medicare can negotiate lower prescription drug prices with these companies. The fact that this ban, and it is a ban in federal law, is still in place is one of the most egregious examples of this corruption within our government. I think what I didn't realize until just a few months ago is that the United States government is the #1 purchaser of prescription drugs in the entire world. In the entire world. So when you look about purchasing power and the kind of leverage that gives us as the consumer, that that our political leaders have completely given away by prohibiting our government from negotiating lower drug prices, is an outright giveaway to the prescription drug companies. Because we're the biggest customer, that means we have the greatest opportunity to bring these prices down by negotiating lower. The second thing is patent reform. Right now, these prescription drug companies in particular are exploiting loopholes within our current patent law that allow them, let's say they've got a patent that gives them the ability to produce this drug for 7 years, and then it's supposed to go to the generics where they can bring down the costs, right? Well, they'll change one minor thing that doesn't change the drug at all. They'll just make one little tweak that allows that clock to reset, and they can continue to block the generics from coming in. They call it patent parking. This is something that's got to change. That loophole has got to close so that there you have competition and you're able to bring the cost of these drug prices down.
My proposal actually gives the patient a say in what,
Absolutely. I think that's a very, very important part of this. But if you only have a giant prescription drug company as the only one who's allowed to produce a very specific drug, especially a life-saving drug, you talk about insulin in your paper here, and they're patent parking and blocking any other generic company from coming in and producing that drug at a lower price, then you as the consumer, you still don't have options. The third thing I'll mention, and there's a lot more that needs to be done here, but the third thing is allowing for the reimportation of these drugs from countries like Canada at a lower price. One of our supporters. Can you give Karina can you just share what you shared with me about your daughter and her juvenile diabetes and what you've had to do in order to make sure she gets the medicine she needs?
Well, when my daughter was diagnosed, we didn't have insurance at the time, so we were getting our.
And how old was she?
She was 9 at the time, and so we were buying our insulin from Mexico. In the U.S., a little vial of insulin can cost up to $300
Here in the United
in
States.
the U.S.
Without insurance.
Without insurance, but if you cross the border, it's $30. So that's how we're getting our insulin, going to Mexico.
Yeah. And there are so many families who are faced with this same situation where they have no other option. They can't afford the insurance, and they can't afford the medicine here.
Exactly.
Thank you. This is such an important issue. Thanks. Yes, ma'am.
I just had a question about how you feel we should deal with the Alzheimer's crisis.
Yeah.
I volunteered for the Alzheimer's Association, and my husband was put in at 52. There's not any medicine right now to effectively treat it, to cure it. I don't really understand why it happens. There's about 6 billion people now that have it. In the next few years, that's going to triple. And my concern is how we try to deal with all of this. I know the NIH needs to be funded for research dollars and so on. And I know that you signed on for the BOLD Act, and I appreciate that because that's a help, and we need to fund that also. So I guess, and my understanding is that a lot of the Medicare dollars that we spend go towards people with this kind of a disease. The other thing that I've run into also now is that my husband recently has gone into care, and what they call memory care is not standardized in any of the facilities, so they can kind of decide who they want in their centers and who they don't. I know someone that has had her husband in 5 different places just because, you know, something insignificant happens and they're like, oh, they'd rather have someone just drugged and sitting in a chair, basically. My husband's in his 2nd facility right now, and it's just a big crisis, and there's so many people that are affected by it. It's hard to find someone that isn't, and I just wanted to know kind of what your thoughts were on that, and it's a complicated issue, and I understand that too.
Thank you. Well, thanks for being here and raising this. It's heartbreaking to see how many more people, as we hold gatherings like this, are coming and sharing very similar stories, and especially those of loved ones who are seeing this Alzheimer's beginning at such a young age, and like you said, no real information about why or how this is happening so early on in life and in increasing numbers, which is why it is so important that we dedicate these dollars and resources towards getting this information, because right now it's you're operating blind and not knowing exactly how we got here, and then really what can be done about it. The resources that are going towards caregiving, given there are more and more people who are getting Alzheimer's at a younger age, this is not just something that's happening to those, like it did to my grandfather who had Alzheimer's. It was very near the end of his life. So we're talking about what does this mean for caregivers like yourself, whether you're able to provide that care at home or it needs to be somewhere else. How long will this care need to be provided for? These are all things that I think we need to examine both at a very deep and personal level, but also as we look at our healthcare system. It's not currently set up for this kind of thing, and making sure that we're actually providing the care that people need and that will help them, rather than just plying them with more drugs. I think that really gets to the heart of what can we do now to make it so that someone is most comfortable and cared for, when too often, not just for Alzheimer's, for other things as well, the answer has just been numb them and give them more drugs so that they become, docile and not quote unquote causing anyone any problems. My heart goes out to you and your family. I wish you very, very well, and please know that this is something that we have been and will continue to focus on as a priority.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
I appreciate your support of that.
Thank you.
Hi. You brought up, of course, some 3 different subjects that is really powerful, but one of the subjects to me has to do with school and teaching and making sure for our next generation. And I know, of course, everybody talks about how schools should be paid for and everything, but my concern is more as in what is that education and how we're supposed to take and bring it up more than that notch than what we already are, so we are competitive in the world and things like that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is such a great question because you're right, it's not often talked about. It's, yes, we need to make sure that our teachers are paid well, that they have the tools they need to teach our kids, that people have access to opportunities for secondary education, whether that be apprenticeships, vocational training, community college, bachelor's degree, whatever those opportunities are that they're seeking. But that quality of education, I think, is so important and is so often lost. And are you a teacher by chance? Well, there you go. It is usually teachers or those who are directly involved in education, right? At the boots on the ground level who are asking these questions and whose voices are so often removed and not a part of the policy making process in Washington. And this is why, again, both through different administrations that come through, you end up with things that sound really good and have good intention, maybe like No Child Left Behind, and you have different programs that are put in place by the federal government that ultimately, once it hits the classrooms, you end up in a situation where teachers are forced to just teach to the test to say, well, if I got to meet these marks and hit these goals in order to get this amount of funding and make sure that we don't fall below a certain line, then you're taking away the power of and the ability for teachers to do what they do best and to focus on that quality of education and recognizing that, I'll use one example in Hawaii. Native Hawaiian culture and education is a part of the overall education system, as it should be. We live in a very diverse state, and we have a very unique Native culture there, and that's a part of the education. And there was an elementary school that we were working with where you had a Native Hawaiian, they call kupunas, like an elder who's a cultural practitioner who comes in and teaches the kids songs and different things about protection of the land and how this was done in Native Hawaiian culture, how it's important now, and so on and so forth. Well, they stopped this woman from coming in and teaching these classes because she didn't have a master's degree. But she had all of this knowledge that was passed down from generation to generation to generation to generation that you couldn't learn by writing a paper and earning a master's degree. It's one example of many to recognize there are differences and different needs that must be met in different local communities, and taking a heavy-handed top-down approach is actually undermining the interests of our kids and our young people and therefore our future. So for me, in my approach to education policy, a central part of it would be convening a council of teachers, educators, people who are involved in education at the local levels and coming together from different parts of the country and playing a central role in forming that policy and determining, okay, well, your local school board is modeled differently from the one in Hawaii. In Hawaii, we have one statewide school board. Some argue whether or not that's a good system or not, but that's the system that we have there. Yours is not the case, right? You have a local school board in many different communities. Respecting that local governance and then coming in at the federal level saying, how can we best empower you at the local level to provide our kids with the education that we need, rather than coming in from the top down and saying, well, here's what you must do, and you must meet these criteria that we set in order to get the funds and the resources that you need to do your job. Thank you. Yes.
So I know that you were a co-sponsor of HR 676, and you're also a co-sponsor of, I believe it's 1384, the Expand Medicare for All Act of 2019. How do those differ from what you would propose in your Medicare choice? And also, how does this differ from the bill that Senator Sanders has put forth? If you could
I think if you
compare.
look at those three different pieces of legislation, they are not all carbon copies. They all present different ideas on ultimately how to accomplish health care for all, Medicare for all. I think those two terms, you know, Medicare takes the idea of an existing system, which by the way is not perfect in its own right and needs to be improved and strengthened, and it expands it. All of those pieces of legislation take slightly different approaches on how to do that. I think one key difference is that, in my view, that is the core of how we make sure that everyone gets the quality care that they need, bringing down the overall costs that we are putting into the healthcare system. My approach would allow people to have the freedom to choose if they want to keep whatever existing plan they have, or if they want to purchase into a private healthcare system. I think it's important as we look at this to see that in either the Bernie Sanders plan or others, and also what I'm talking about, it's hard to compare what we have today to that, because you're completely overhauling and changing the system. That for a healthcare for all plan, a Medicare for all plan, you are literally taking out that middleman, the private insurance companies who are making, whose overhead and administrative costs are pretty massive, bringing down that cost and expanding and improving that care to make sure everyone gets the health care they need. So that is a major shift. The private insurance market will shift and adapt accordingly. But once again, I think it's important in this country that people have the freedom to choose what kind of health care they want for themselves and their families. The bottom line is we're not leaving anyone behind. Thank you. Yes.
I have two very different questions.
Okay.
The first one has to do, I'm a veteran of the United States Army, 1988.
I remember we met the last time I was here.
Yes. So the new numbers are out from the VA on veteran suicide, and we're up to 70.7% of veterans, this is a trigger question, so are dying by firearm. And we have a compounding problem where we have several states, of course, where it's okay to smoke cannabis now, it's legal, but veterans that are self-medicating because they cannot go to their VAs and have THC in their system, because if they get caught, their meds will get cut off from them.
Yeah.
Any med that is a substance like their Adderall, they're getting tested, they're getting screened, they're mandatory getting drop tested. And if they get caught, they lose their access to all of their meds, and that is a benefit that does get cut off. That needs to stop. So what can you do to help stop that? Because PTSD is a war benefit. So they know if they commit suicide, instead of seeking care, their families will obtain their war benefit. And they'd rather do that and make sure their families are taken care of than go seek care, get caught having THC in their system because they've self-medicated. So we've created this catch-22 cycle, and that's why we have 22 a day. And so I'd like to beseech you, as someone who is in the service, who understands this fundamentally, because you're doing what you can at a top level to change these things through your legislation, but to dig deeper, to look at those numbers, and what can you do to stop that testing of THC and make sure that we're really truly collaborating between civilian and federal resources to make those money dollars get put to use and get the veterans the care that they need. What can you do there?
Yeah. Thank you. And thank you for your service and continued advocacy for our brothers and sisters who are still struggling in so many different ways. This is one of the main reasons why for so long in Congress now I've been pushing for an end to the federal marijuana prohibition. And we have the only bipartisan bill in Congress that does that, the only bipartisan bill in Congress that very simply ends the federal marijuana prohibition. As you've said, there are too many of our brothers and sisters in uniform who have suffered simply because of this outdated and destructive law that is on the books. A few friends of mine and those who I've met since are those who have come home from multiple combat deployments, dealing with traumatic brain injury, post-traumatic stress, chronic pain. They do not want any of the highly addictive opioids that they are offered through the VA, but they are struggling, and like you said, they end up self-medicating. So they'll go and they'll find marijuana, or they self-medicate with alcohol or other things. And a lot of them have lost all of their veterans' benefits as a result. Some of them have been dishonorably discharged from the military as a result of a positive marijuana test, which means they have no access to their GI Bill, they have no access to a VA home loan guarantee, they have no access to VA health care because of this one terribly outdated federal bill. And so they're caught between a rock and a hard place of wondering, well, what do I do now? And then you see how very quickly this leads to a place where they feel they have no other options to escape the pain and the struggle that they're enduring. We have to end this prohibition to make it so that if they're seeking help from the VA is able to provide that help and say, here are the options that are before you, here are the side effects or the consequences that you're gonna have to deal with, and make that choice for yourself about what's going to best help you. We need to provide, this is again, I hate saying this because people talk about it all the time, but it's real. We've got to be able to take the resources we are sending to the VA and make sure it's getting to those care providers who are available around the clock 24/7, so that when a veteran calls or knocks on the door and says, I need help, they get the help they need immediately. Immediately. Still, for as long as we've been repeating this statistic, which has been going on for far too long, about 22 veterans on average every single day taking their own lives, still, veterans who take that big step, and for those who've served, it's not an easy step to take, to go in and ask for help. For a lot of veterans, it takes years. It takes years just to break down those barriers and say, you know what, I need help. And then when they do, they either get a voicemail message on the phone, they're not able to talk to a live person, or when they go in person, they're not able to get that direct care that they need. They get run through well, you know, go see someone else, go see here, come back on Monday, come back in a month, we'll see you in 3 months, and unfortunately by that time it's too late. We've got to take this mission that the VA has and the responsibility that our government has seriously, to honor those who have been willing to put their lives on the line for our country by ensuring that they get the direct and immediate quality care and benefits that they have earned. Thank you.
Hi, Tulsi. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
My name's Alexis, and I have two.
And who's in your arms?
Oh, and this is Odin. He's napping.
Good.
So I'm like, I want to ask your question boldly, but also keep the baby.
All right, all right.
So one of the things that I just recently dealt with was childbirth. Woo! And one of the big problems that we're having is the hospital care for mothers and postpartum depression, as well as the mortality rate for mothers and women of color specifically.
Yes.
I had a home birth, and I had to pay out of pocket for a midwife because I didn't trust the doctors that we have available here in my community. And so I guess my question for you is, how are you going to make it easier for mothers to enjoy giving birth instead of hating every aspect of it?
Thank you, Alexa, for being here and for sharing your experience and bringing voice to, I'm sure, a concern and a question that so many other mothers have and the struggles that they're dealing with. And thank you for coming and sharing that with us today. When we look at the healthcare system that we have, too often we see that it's not a system that promotes the health and well-being of people. It's one that is more of a sick care system than anything else. Rather than incentivizing and promoting and empowering people to make the best decisions possible for their own health and the health of their family and their children, we're limited in the options that we have. So much of this goes back to big insurance and saying, well, you know, here's the limitations in the plan that you have. You're only able to afford this much, so you're only able to get this much, when, you know, the choice, limiting your choice in the end, where the choice that you may make is something that may actually end up costing less. It would cost less for you to have a midwife helping you birth in your home than it would to put you in a hospital for a day or a few days with a doctor. But you don't have the option to do that given the insurance or the coverage that you have. If we completely change the way we look at our healthcare system to one that is actually promoting the health and well-being of our people, then we open the doors to other modalities of care and providing more choice to people to make the best decisions for themselves and their families, and one that's actually focused on not just the immediate need. You brought up postpartum depression and what comes after. We have to look at the health and well-being of the whole person rather than looking at this as though it is merely a transaction. Well, this is how much you get for this amount. Obviously, care, these things cost money, but we look at this from a broader perspective, not as a profit-making venture, but one that's focused on the delivery of care to people. Then I think we begin to get to the root cause of so many of the obstacles that stand in the way of a new mother or a young mother or someone who maybe has many kids already, feeling as though her options are very limited, that she's not able to make the kinds of decisions that she wants and needs. I hope that answers your question. It's not an easy one. I don't pretend that it is, but getting to the heart of the kind of change we need to see is where we need to begin.
This is our last question.
Hi. I agree with you as far as regime change wars and the interplay between domestic and foreign policy. How do you propose to prioritize decreasing, whether it be our troops overseas and the military spending, because that's the biggest part of our budget, and cutting that back without a lot of blowback? I mean, how do you start prioritizing what you're going to do? We have a person in the White House now that doesn't want to be in alliances or unless the other partners pay their fair share.
And he's
quote
choosing
unquote.
all the wrong alliances.
Right. But so this is a big part of your, and I agree with it, because money we spend on these things that are unnecessary could go to education, healthcare.
Yeah.
So
Thank you. Yeah, this is such an important question. Let's first begin with wrapping our heads around how much we actually spend on defense, because the numbers that are on the books, the over $700 billion that we've seen in the last couple of years, the defense authorization bill authorizing that amount of money, I think it exceeds the spending of the top 5 defense spending in, Russia, China, the UK, France, and Germany combined. We spend more than all of them combined. That's not the limit of it, though. That's what's in the defense bill. That does not include the billions that are in the Overseas Contingency Operation Fund, which is commonly known as the OCO Fund, which really is a slush fund for the Department of Defense. So for many of the years that I've been in Congress, there's been a cap on spending. It's no longer there, but there's been a cap on spending in every department about how much you're allowed to spend, including in the Department of Defense. Well, that number has been exceeded by saying, well, okay, we'll spend this amount on the books, and then we'll put another few $100 billion in the OCO funding slush fund, which means you don't have the accountability and the limitations that you have in the normal Defense Authorization Act passed by Congress that says, okay, well, here's the allotment for this account or for this program or for this mission. And instead it just says, here's a pot of money that the Defense Department gets to spend. It was put in place to, I mean, in the post 9/11 era where you have, you know, last minute or unanticipated needs on the battlefield, that you're able to pull from that to meet those needs, but it has become something that just says, all right, well, it's not in the defense fund, so we'll just pass this separately as part of the slush fund. So we've got to take that into account. We've got to take into account all the funding that goes outside of the Department of Defense, but are parallel to those missions, those regime change wars we're talking about. The funding that goes through our intel community services, through the CIA, the funding that goes through the State Department. When you look at all of the nation building that comes about as a direct result of these regime change wars, you see how these numbers continue to skyrocket to the point where we've spent trillions of dollars. In Afghanistan alone, again, the numbers are a bit murky, but we have spent north of $1 trillion just in that country. And we, as taxpayers, are continuing to spend $4 billion every month there. So that is the first place to start, by ending these wasteful regime change wars, making sure that we don't start any new ones. Across the board in these different federal departments, we're bringing down the cost of what we are spending. Looking at, and then from there we begin to say, okay, once we're at that point, we have to work on de-escalating tensions between other nuclear armed countries, the United States and Russia, so that we can end the arms race that goes along with that. Something that has begun long before but has been escalated by President Trump, tearing up the INF treaty, letting out more contracts for billions of dollars to build these missiles and arms that were previously banned under these treaties, further bringing down the cost and also making it so that we in the world live in a safer place. We look at where our troops are based all around the world and make an assessment on every one of those. What purpose are they serving there? For so long, you know, well, we've got troops in this country and that country. Why are they there? Well, they've been there for the last 40 or 50 years, and so must be important, right? Well, I don't know. Maybe it was. Maybe it served a purpose at a certain point in time, but does it serve the national security interests and needs of the American people of the United States now? That assessment has to be made, and not only in where our troops are around the world, but where we're spending money for our troops here at home. Make no mistake, we need to have a trained and ready, capable military. We need to make sure our troops have what they need to fulfill their mission, that we are taking care of them and their families. Keeping that focus in mind, let's look at the different bases and the different training opportunities that we have here at home. This is something that is so politicized in Congress, because every time there's talk of, well, hey, there's a base in this part of the country that's no longer needed, let's shut it down, it becomes very controversial, where the Department of Defense is saying, we don't need this, we don't want it, our troops don't need it, but it becomes a political issue. Well, how many jobs is that base creating? Never mind that it's not necessary anymore. And so we end up spending more and more money because what? To meet what objective? Those questions aren't answered. So this is the approach that I would take in looking at our defense spending, both in the changes in our policy and how we bring down that cost, and at a practical level, look at how we're spending money for equipping, training, and taking care of our troops and our military, and making sure that it's being spent in the most effective and efficient way, and looking at those areas of waste that can and should be cut. Thank you.
Thanks so much for everyone. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming. If you would like a quick picture with Tulsi, line up behind Kareen over here. We are unfortunately on a tight schedule today. And if you like what you heard and want to join this campaign, on your way out, you'll see Vrindy and I believe Chris, who's somewhere else over here. And you can sign up to caucus for us for a yard sign and volunteer on the campaign regularly. So thanks so much for being here.
Can you come up and say hi? You want something? I just want to say thanks to Steve.
I drove 13 hours.
Oh my gosh.
To Thanksgiving. I didn't know that was the last question. In the hopes to get 13 seconds.
Let's get 13. Yes.
13 seconds.
Yes, I got you.
Yeah.
I do.
You have to do something to grab the spotlight. And once it's on you, you have to have have something to say. All of those issues we've been talking about are important. Not always easy, and sometimes life can be deceiving. If you don't bring this country together, it's always better when we're together. So I've been here, I can help you. I put my number in there. If you want to call another time, last week you were talking about people getting Medicare and getting the wrong number.
Yeah.
I called you 3 or 4 times to say something. But my point is simple. You grab the spotlight, you have something to say that will tug at, that will touch the heart and the mind and spirit of the people. If you don't do that, you're not going to be president. If you do that, you're going to be.
What's your name? Thank you, Maya. Where did you drive from?
Arkansas.
Oh my gosh.
Little Rock. When the morning light sings and brings
Wow, that's incredible.
To say what I said,
Thank you.
I'm kind of glad that I didn't say it in front of everybody. I didn't want to embarrass you.
No, not at all. I thank you very much for that. I'm going to look for your number.
I can help you get the spotlight. I can tell you to solve, you know, all of these issues are important.
They are. To coming together as a nation. I agree with you. Thank you. Thank you, Michael.
I've got a photo.
There you go. Thank you. Can I give you a hug? Appreciate it.
Oh my God.
Be safe
Now
in
you
your
take
drive
that.
back.
Oh, I won't get a copy of it then. No.
Okay. Let's take a picture for you.
Yeah, I do have. If you take a picture of this on the phone and I share it with the ladies that this is funny. Oh, I turned it off for the meeting.
When are you driving back?
I think I'm going to go to this country corn thing. But
Okay,
if you,
good.
If you
You
told
should.
me you wanted to hear more, I
We've
would
got a
say,
town hall in Dubuque tonight, but I'm going to follow up with you. Yeah, we've got to hit the road and drive right after
I can
this.
tell you how to get the spotlight. I can tell you how to make people know that. Or I can tell you a way, not
Okay.
the way.
Okay.
A way.
No, that's good.
I know you got it.
You should stick around and go to this thing tonight, though.
Oh, I want to.
I definitely don't want you turning around and driving back
I
again.
really wish you could take time to do.
I wish I could too.
I'm a music person. All right, you want the phone, right?
All right.
You know what's going to happen here? I'm going to share this with the Hayes Center, which is a senior citizens
Okay.
place.
Okay, good.
Also,
1, 2, 3.
it was
Thank
worth
you.
the drive.
Thank you very much. I'm truly grateful, Michael. Thank you. I look forward to talking soon.
How are you?
Thank you. How are you? Nice to see you. How are you?
I'm good.
1, 2, 3.
Thanks for coming back to
Time.
Muscatine.
I know, it's so good to be back. I wish we had more time, but it's great seeing you again. Absolutely. Thank you, sir, and thank you for sharing your well thought out plan.
Listen, I have an Airbnb in St. Louis.
Okay.
I want you all to come down there.
Okay.
Stay in my place. I want you to come down there. Of course, I have in northern Missouri too, and we have Florida as well.
Wow.
Okay, ready?
So we're all
1, 2, 3. Awesome.
You're all over.
one tip. Okay. Instead of concentrating on the corporate farms, I would concentrate on the fact that Russia and Brazil are increasing their soybean productions, which
True.
means that we're going to be losing market share because of this boycott.
That's true.
Yeah?
Yep.
That's what I would say.
The
That would
tariff
hit us
war.
more than
Yeah.
anything.
Thank you.
St. Louis, remember?
All righty.
Down.
Thank you.
Hi, Tulsi. I'm Travis.
Sorry, Travis.
Nice to
Thanks
meet
for
you.
being here tonight.
1, 2, 3.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate you taking time
Thank
with
you.
us. Thank you. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you
Wes
being here.
Clemens' mom.
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
that's
I'm doing it.
right.
So I finally
Nice.
got down here.
I'm so glad you came.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
1, 2, 3.
Well, thanks for your continued advocacy, and give my best to Wes and
I will.
Jody. Thank you. Hi, what's your name?
I'm Grant.
Nice to meet you, Grant. Thanks for being here. Awesome. Thank you so much. Nice to see you again. How are you?
I'm doing well, good. I'm glad you're here. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Guys, wait, I want my medals to show. Hold on.
There you go.
1, 2, 3. I have a question for you.
Yeah.
So, I actually wrote a bill here in Iowa for suicidal veterans that gives them point-of-care access to care where they seek it in a 24-hour hold. But I want to push it further because of that access to firearms.
Yeah.
I want them to get like a 5150 where their weapon can be taken away if the doctor declares them unsafe.
Yeah.
But I want to push it further. I want it at the federal level as well.
Okay.
We need like a companion bill.
Yeah.
So like if I write something, can you do
Yeah.
it like at the federal level too?
Yeah.
Would you work with me?
Yes, I
You
would love to. I would
Sweet.
love to.
Deal.
I want to give you
Alright.
the email address of my congressional staff
All right.
because I want to make sure this doesn't get blocked up anywhere.
Yeah.
Do you have a paper or anything?
Sweet. My bill
If
is
you
House
can-
File 210. It's really simple. It directs the Iowa
Can you grab a piece of paper over there, please?
Association to add to their code, hospital code,
Okay.
the 24-hour.
Got it.
And since it's paid for by the Mission Act, so there's really
Yeah.
not a reason for them to do it.
Yeah.
It just got political because the lady that she was mad about the abortion debate, so she held it up in the Human Resources Committee and
Yep.
wouldn't let it out during funnel. And so I got to get it into a different committee this year and try to get it through. But if I have it attached, I think to a federal companion bill, I think I can get it through a lot easier.
Yeah.
So
This is Guido, Guido.
Nice.
Weiss
All right.
at mail.house.
I'm Italian. That's perfect.
Perfect. All right.
All right. Ready?
Thank you so much. Nice to see you again. Hello again.
Hello.
Did you guys get enough food at the market for lunch?
Yeah, we did.
Okay, good.
1, 2, 3.
Thank you.
Cool.
And we will see you tonight.
See you tonight. Thank you guys.
This background is like.
No, it's awesome. How are you? It's good to see you. I saw you. Yes.